At the turn of the 20th century, paved roads in the United States were exceedingly rare. With the exception of the biggest cities, most American roads had scarcely changed since pioneer times. This was a problem for a recent invention, the automobile, which was quickly growing in popularity. Cars were poised to revolutionize the way the world moved, but with few good roads to speak of, they were impractical for traveling any great distance. One group raising awareness of this issue was the National Good Roads Association, which formed in St. Louis, Missouri in 1893. This group advocated for road improvements throughout the country, and was a major voice in this growing national concern. In 1905, the association planned to hold its annual convention in Portland, Oregon. The city was preparing a major event of its own, called the Lewis and Clark Centennial Exposition. This unofficial World's Fair would celebrate the 100th anniversary of the Lewis and Clark expedition. But more importantly, it would bring international attention to this fairly small city, with the hope of boosting it from an economic slump. The Good Roads Convention would be just one of many events that would take place here throughout the summer. 2,000 miles away, in Detroit, Michigan, news of the upcoming event got the attention of Frederick Smith, the head of Olds Motor Works. With the nation's eyes soon being focused on Portland, Smith wanted a publicity stunt that would put his company in the spotlight. He recalled a similar situation 2 years earlier, when the company had sponsored Lester Whitman to drive across the entire United States. Whitman completed the journey in 73 days, but he wasn't actually the first person to drive an automobile across the country. That distinction went to Horatio Jackson, who had taken a similar trip a couple months earlier, completing it in 63 days. In the short span of time between these two trips, Tom Fetch had done it as well, completing it in 62 days. A year later, in 1904, Lester Whitman would make the trip again, this time completing it in a record 33 days. While these trips were as impressive as they were historic, all of them had taken place from San Francisco to New York City. No one had ever driven across the country from east to west. Likewise, while automobile racing was already a thriving sport, no one had attempted a race across the entire continent. Such an event would certainly draw national attention, and the Good Roads Convention in Portland would be the perfect finish line. With the Good Roads Convention starting in just a couple months' time, preparations for the race would have to start immediately. With no time to lose, Frederick Smith enlisted the help of James Abbott, a federal agent with the U.S. Office of Public Roads. As one of the foremost supporters of the Good Roads movement, Abbott would be responsible for organizing the race. Assisting with the promotional aspects was Roy Chapin, the head of sales at Olds Motor Works. The men devised a route that would take the drivers some 3,600 miles from New York to Portland. With the roads being poor in many areas and non-existent in others, this would be no pleasure drive. It would be a true test of human endurance. The grueling journey would illustrate just how badly the US needed better roads. Naturally, 2 Oldsmobile vehicles were supplied for the race. At a whopping 7 horsepower, the Curved Dash Runabout was not the most powerful car on the market. It was, however, the best-selling car of its time. The Curved Dash was the first mass-produced car in the US, predating the Ford Model T by several years. At a price of $650, or about $23,000 today, it was designed to be approachable to the mass market. The race would be a testament to this car's simple design, showing off its reliability even in the most treacherous conditions. A call for drivers was put out in late April, inviting volunteers to apply for this historic journey. At stake would be a prize of $1,000, or about $35,000 today. Hundreds of applications were received in just a few days, and among them, 2 drivers were soon selected. One of these was 30-year-old Percy McGargle of Buffalo, New York. McGargle was a well-known journalist among the auto crowd, and had a number of achievements under his belt. In the previous summer, he and 2 other men had driven 1,300 miles from New York to St. Louis. Their task was to map out the route for a long-distance endurance run, which would soon take drivers to the St. Louis World's Fair. After a grueling 5 weeks of mapping the route, McGargle returned to New York and was one of several drivers to participate in the event itself. His opponent in the cross-country race would be 31-year-old Dwight Huss of Detroit, Michigan. As an employee of Olds Motor Works, Huss was an expert in the company's vehicles, and was a respected name in the automotive community. In 1903, he had traveled to England to participate in a series of reliability trials across the country. Driving an Oldsmobile Curve Dash, he took home the gold medal in his class, beating out dozens of drivers from other countries. In 1904, he had also participated in the long-distance run to St. Louis that Percy McGargle had helped put together. To assist them in the cross-country trip, each driver was paired with an Oldsmobile mechanic. Percy McGargle was joined by Barton Stanchfield, a mechanic who worked at the Olds plant in Lansing, Michigan. Dwight Huss was joined by Milford Weigel, a mechanic based at the Olds factory in Detroit. As a final touch, McGargle and Stanchfield's car was named Old Steady, while Huss and Weigel's car was named Old Scout. In a matter of days, the names of these vehicles, and the men who drove them, would soon be known across the nation. On the morning of May 8, 1905, a large crowd gathered at Columbus Circle in Manhattan, New York. At the stroke of 9:30 a.m., amidst the cheers of well-wishers, Old Scout and Old Steady set off on their historic journey. Speeding through the city streets, they stopped for a quick photo and final farewells before making their way out of the city. In terms of when the vehicles would arrive in Portland, no one could say for sure. The Good Roads Convention was set to begin in about 6 weeks, but most people agreed that the drivers would get there well ahead of that. The first day's journey took them north out of the city and into upstate New York, following the east bank of the Hudson River. By nightfall, both cars arrived in Albany, with Old Scout arriving first, and Old Steady arriving about 45 minutes later. While the weather had been clear the first day, heavy rains soon turned the dirt roads into thick mud. With no protection from the elements, the drivers were soon covered in mud from head to toe. Despite this, they made good time as they crossed New York State. By the evening of May 10th, they had made it as far as Buffalo. Percy McGargle later described their surroundings, writing, "We struck a section of the country where automobiles appeared to be unknown. A small boy on his way to school, whom we stopped to ask about the road, was frightened and commenced to cry violently. Soon after, a girl, after taking one look at us mud-covered tourists, gave a yell and started down the road at top speed." A while after leaving Buffalo, both teams arrived in Erie, Pennsylvania at about the same time, but Old Steady was soon delayed by a flat tire. Amidst a heavy downpour, Old Scout made it as far as Painesville, Ohio for the night, while Old Steady only got as far as Conneaut, about 40 miles behind. By the next morning, McGargle and Stanchfield caught up with their rivals in Cleveland, and the two were once again on equal footing. However, the running was far from easy, as severe flooding made the roads almost impossible to follow. This would be a common theme in the coming weeks, and would greatly limit how many miles they could cover each day. The next morning, the drivers passed through Toledo, then headed westward to Indiana. By the evening of May 14th, they had arrived in Hammond, rounding out their first full week on the road. As Dwight Huss told the press, "A 2 weeks' rain just before we crossed Illinois made the roads soft and sticky beyond description. Only those who have driven over the gumbo roads after a rain can understand the difficulties we encountered. We rode in mud up to the hubs at times, and I have seen the wheels many a time with so much gumbo sticking to them that they would weigh 250 to 300 pounds each." All things considered, Old Scout and Old Steady were holding up remarkably well, and Olds Motor Works wasted no time in promoting this. Newspaper ads were already circulating around the country, praising the cars for their reliability in these harsh conditions. By this point, the drivers had reached Chicago, where they made a brief stop to clean and service their vehicles. For the next few days, they crossed Illinois, slogging their way through the water and mud. By May 18th, they had arrived at Moline and crossed the Mississippi River into Davenport, Iowa. From here, the teams pressed on, passing through Iowa City and trudging across Iowa for the next few days. McGargle recalled this section of the trip, writing, "One of the worst mud holes thus far encountered was the Skunk River bottoms. Huss and I agreed to help each other across, or neither of us would have ever reached the other side. First, one car would plunge into the water and mud until stuck. Then we would rig our blocks and tackle. By all of us pushing and the free car towing, we managed to work our way across a swamp that everyone told us was impassable. Thanks to their teamwork, the drivers made it safely to Des Moines later that evening. A couple days later, on May 22nd, they crossed the Missouri River into Omaha, Nebraska. Here they would have their first meaningful rest after 2 weeks of some of the worst road conditions they had ever faced. Over the next 3 days, the men stayed in Omaha, getting some much-needed rest, repairing the vehicles, and taking on supplies. As Percy McGargle told the press, "This will be the first full night's rest we have had since starting on the road 2 weeks ago. We have gone to bed several times along the road, but always have had to get out from 3 to 4 o'clock in the morning." Dwight Huss elaborated on this layover, writing, "On the trip to Omaha, both machines had carried as light baggage as possible, each having about 200 pounds weight aboard besides the drivers. At Omaha we equipped for the wilder country ahead, taking on extra fuel and water tanks for desert driving, sand tires, firearms, and cooking utensils, all of which increased the weight materially. For the next several hundred miles, the drivers would follow the route of the Union Pacific Railroad. As they would be heading into more remote parts of the country, this would not only serve as a lifeline, but it would also be a way to track their progress. The race had been getting national press coverage over the last 2 weeks, and Americans were riveted by the updates that were coming in almost daily. Since telegraph men were stationed along the railroad's route, the drivers' progress would continue to be reported even as they traveled through the wilderness. On May 25th, Old Scout and Old Steady set out from Omaha, passing through Fremont and Columbus. As they trudged through the plains of Nebraska, heavy rainstorms and severe flooding caused both teams to lose track of the road and get lost. Huss and Weigel eventually found the path again and reached Grand Island. However, McGargle and Stanchfield followed a spur line of the railroad by mistake, ending up in Palmer instead. While this was a fairly small detour, they were eager to catch up with Old Scout the next morning. As McGargle recalled, "Before reaching Grand Island, we were unfortunate enough to crash through a bridge, part of which had been washed away. The fall broke both side springs of our car, the strut rod on the front axle, and bent both the front and rear axles. Stanchfield succeeded in making temporary repairs, which enabled us to travel some 15 miles into town, where much valuable time was lost getting Old Steady into shape again." Because of this major accident, McGargle and Stanchfield only got as far as Grand Island, while Huss and Weigel had passed Kearney and spent the night in Overton. Over the next few days, Old Steady tried to close the gap, but Old Scout continued to pace far ahead. By May 29th, Huss and Weigel had reached North Platte, and on May 30th they dipped down into Colorado for a stop in Julesburg. On May 31st, they made some of the best mileage they had seen in weeks, making it all the way to Cheyenne, Wyoming. McGargle and Stanchfield were now well over 100 miles behind, spending the night in Lodgepole, Nebraska. But despite their poor luck so far, the men's spirits remained high. McGargle commented on the changing conditions of the West, writing, "Gasoline prices have commenced to come pretty high, while the quality goes in the opposite direction. Water, too, is a very scarce commodity, and it is sometimes 10 miles before we come to a well or stream. For several days we have been wearing our revolvers in plain sight, with our belts bristling with cartridges, as do many riders we meet along the road." Meanwhile, on June 1st, about 1,500 miles away, the Lewis and Clark Exposition officially kicked off in Portland. The significance of the fair could not be overstated, as this was considered the biggest event in Oregon's history up to that point. The opening day ceremonies were attended by some 40,000 people, marking a successful start to the fair. With the National Good Roads Convention set to begin in less than 3 weeks, Old Scout and Old Steady had plenty of ground yet to cover if they were going to get there in time. Departing from Cheyenne on June 1st, Huss and Weigel headed up an elevation as they approached the Rocky Mountains. Fortunately, the day's journey was relatively easy, allowing Huss to take a detour to Ames Monument along the way. After a fairly uneventful run, Old Scout reached Laramie later that evening. Meanwhile, McGargle and Stanchfield arrived in Cheyenne, closing the gap by a significant amount. The next day, Old Scout followed the railroad out of Laramie and made it as far as Medicine Bow. Old Steady made it to Laramie, and from here they split off on a different route from Old Scout, hoping to take a shortcut through the mountains. Along the way, the men encountered several parties of covered wagons, much like the ones that had been used on the Oregon Trail. These were a relic even by 1905 standards, but some people still chose to travel this way, often because they couldn't afford to move their entire family and possessions by train. While Old Steady's path was supposed to be a shortcut, they were slowed down by the mountainous terrain and harsh weather. As McGargle recalled, "We ran into as fierce a snowstorm as one experiences in the east in midwinter. It lasted only for a few moments, but we were not prepared for snowstorms, and with the wind whistling around our heads and the snow blowing in flurries about us, we felt the cold keenly." While Old Steady had only gotten as far as Elk Mountain, Old Scout was making exceptional progress. By June 4th, Huss and Weigel had made it all the way to Green River, some 200 miles ahead. The running wasn't easy though, as they had forded some difficult rivers along the way, and had almost lost Old Scout in a giant sinkhole. As Huss later wrote, "I don't want to say much about the roads between these points, because it takes more than a pen to describe them. I don't know how Old Scout ever lived through it, but she did. We forded 5 big creeks, driving over rocks and stones and so much sagebrush that Old Scout's radiator looked like a badly twisted piece of tin. Even with these challenges, Old Scout was able to get as far as Sage by the next day. Unfortunately, McGargle and Stanchfield continued to have more bad luck as they continued on to Rawlins. As McGargle recalled, "Running short of oil, we bought a small quantity of so-called gas engine oil at a store. When we reached Rawlins, we received a consignment of mobil oil, and unthinkingly, poured it in on top of the other. When we had gone about 5 miles, the car faltered and stopped. When the two oils mixed, they had formed a paint-like solution that the heat of the cylinder transformed into a hardened, sticky gum. With their engine seized up, McGargle and Stanchfield lost a full day while they worked desperately to get it working again. Meanwhile, Huss and Weigel had pressed on, crossing into the next state of Idaho. On June 6, they reached Soda Springs, but the next day, they encountered a mishap of their own. As Huss recalled, "We were on a very steep hill, so steep in fact that it was impossible to hold the car, and we shot down the hill and over a 12-foot embankment into a ditch. The front axle was so badly bent that the wheels were on a slant of 15 degrees. We drove 30 miles in that condition to Pocatello, where we spent part of the night and the next morning getting things straightened. With this delay holding them up, Huss and Weigel got a late start to the day, traveling a fairly short distance to Blackfoot. Meanwhile, McGargle and Stanchfield had managed to get Old Steady working again, and had made it as far as Granger, Wyoming. At this point, the two teams had officially been on the road for a month. When they had left New York 4 weeks earlier, they had expected to be nearing Portland by now. But with over 1,000 miles still to go, it was clear that neither of them would be breaking any speed records on this trip. On the morning of June 9th, Huss and Weigel set out from Blackfoot, Idaho, where a new challenge lay ahead. Here they would cross the desert of the Snake River Plain, which was sparsely populated and would have no hotel accommodations for the next few days. Because this region was so remote, details about their movements here would be scarce. The telegraphs would go silent for the next few days as the nation waited for Old Scout to emerge from the other side. Hundreds of miles back in Wyoming, McGargle and Stanchfield were now struggling with a different kind of challenge entirely. As McGargle wrote, "Poor Stanchfield collapsed with mountain fever. He began to feel ill at Opal, but as there was no doctor there and no fit hotel accommodations, we kept on. Stanchfield riding on the baggage on the rear of the car, wrapped in all the rubber coats we had. When we reached Diamondville, he could stand it no longer, and after getting him to bed, I spent the rest of the day looking up a doctor." At this point, the men conceded that their chance of victory was slim to none. But McGargle was not a quitter by any stretch of the imagination. With Stanchfield's blessing, he headed back on the road to continue the race alone. Meanwhile, after 3 days in the desert, Huss and Weigel puttered their way back into civilization, reaching the major checkpoint of Boise, Idaho. Huss was relieved to arrive here, writing, "3 days earlier we were in a cloudburst, and as a result of the drenching, I suffered from a severe cold. And as we appeared to have a safe lead on Old Steady, we decided to rest here a day or two." Huss and Weigel would ultimately stay in Boise for 3 days, taking the opportunity to recover their health and give Old Scout a much-needed overhaul. By now reports were circulating that Old Steady was out of the race, but in reality, McGargle was pressing on. After 2 days on the road alone, he reached Soda Springs, Idaho. In a stroke of good fortune, Stanchfield had recovered from his illness and had taken the train north, meeting McGargle here to rejoin the race. With a new wind in their sails, the two men agreed to drive day and night, hoping to close the gap between them and Old Scout. Over the next 3 days, they pressed on through Idaho, eventually reaching Blackfoot and setting off into the Snake River Plain. As McGargle recalled, "We were informed that for 40 miles we would meet neither man, beast, nor water. We, however, passed 2 emigrant wagons in the first 40 miles, scared up a herd of antelope, got 2 shots at a mountain lion, killed an 8-foot rattlesnake, and saw prairie chickens, sage hens, and jackrabbits on every hand." Meanwhile, having finished their layover in Boise, Huss and Weigel got back on the road. On June 15th, they crossed the Snake River into Ontario, Oregon, officially reaching the final state in their long journey. In the coming days, good weather and dry roads would allow them to make some of the best daily mileage on the whole trip. Soon after passing through Prineville, they reached the town of Sisters. At last they had reached the base of the Cascade Mountains, the last obstacle standing between them and victory. As the sun rose on June 19th, the National Good Roads Convention was set to begin in just 2 days. Huss and Weigel still had about 200 miles to go, but if everything went well, they could still make it in time. For the journey over the Cascade Mountains, they took the Santiam Wagon Road, a commercial route between Central Oregon and the Willamette Valley. The trek up Santiam Pass was difficult, but Huss and Weigel made the summit by midday, and carefully worked their way down the other side. As Huss later wrote, "So rapid was the descent that it was impossible to hold the car. All brakes were set, the rear wheels were sliding, and Weigel, who was holding to the rear, was dragged nearly 7 miles. I held my breath as well as the steering lever, and expected every minute to be dashed down into the canyon several hundred feet below." With a gut-clenching trip out of the mountains, Huss and Weigel became the first men to cross the Cascades in an automobile. And in the process, they had finally made it to the Willamette Valley. With only 100 miles to go, and smooth roads the whole way, Huss and Weigel were now on the home stretch. With plenty of time now to reach Portland, the men took a leisurely pace, spending their final night in Salem. The next morning, on June 21st, they set off for the final hours of their journey. Being escorted by a crowd of automobiles, Old Scout made its triumphant arrival into Portland. And with that, Dwight Huss and Milford Weigel became the first men to drive across the country from east to west. With an arrival time of 12:58 p.m., their trip was completed in 44 days, 6 hours, and 28 minutes. The men were welcomed as celebrities, being paraded around the city and honored as special guests of the Good Roads Convention, which kicked off just an hour after their arrival. As Huss told the press, "It was the most welcome reception Weigel and I ever got, or ever expect to get, and it made us feel that we were repaid in many ways for our hard trip. We were only sorry that McGargle and Stanchfield were not with us, as they really were entitled to as many honors as we, for it is not their fault they are not here." To their credit, McGargle and Stanchfield had continued pushing onward, even as the news came in that Old Scout had reached the finish line. By this time, they had made it across the border into Oregon, and they figured they could now take a more leisurely pace. Over the next few days, they progressed onward, eventually reaching Sisters and heading into the Cascades. McGargle described their experience crossing the pass, writing, "Everything went well until we were descending the 6th mountain range, when Old Steady commenced to skid. When we struck a rock, both Stanchfield and myself were not only thrown out, but pitched bodily clear across the road into the bushes, followed by most of our trappings. The car, suspended by one rear wheel and the right step, which had caught in some bushes, hung over a 200-foot cliff, and Stanchfield and myself, rubbing the mud out of our eyes, sat on the side of the road, wondering why it did not go all the way over." Having narrowly avoided a disastrous end to their trip, McGargle and Stanchfield made it safely out of the mountains. Over the next 2 days, they enjoyed the smooth roads of the Willamette Valley, and on June 28th, Old Steady finally rolled into Portland. Despite being a full week behind, the men were no less celebrated, as they had endured even more hardships than Huss and Weigel. With their arrival being reported at 4 p.m., McGargle and Stanchfield completed the trip in 51 days, 9 hours, and 30 minutes. McGargle later reflected on their fame, writing, "I am commencing to believe that possibly I do belong to the freak family, a belief strengthened by the numerous mailing cards sent to me, usually containing in bright letters of scarlet, 'It's great to be crazy and ride around in an automobile.'" Shortly after his second-place finish, Percy McGargle was already itching for a new adventure. About 6 weeks later, he returned to New York City and set out on the road once again. In a trip sponsored by the American Motor League, his goal this time was to map out more automobile routes across the country. This would be an even grander adventure than the first, and over the next 10 months, he drove from New York to Portland, down through California and the Southwest states, and back again. Sadly, just 3 years later in 1909, McGargle would pass away from cancer at just 34 years of age. While records don't say what happened to Old Steady after its historic journey, we know a bit more about the fate of Old Scout. Within a few weeks of Dwight Huss's victory, the car was purchased by local businessman and philanthropist E. Henry Wemme. Wemme already had the distinction of owning the first automobile in Oregon, and felt that Old Scout would make a fine addition to his collection. At some point after this, the car was purchased by Edward Cohen, president of the Oldsmobile dealership in Portland. In 1931, Old Scout was reunited with Dwight Huss for the first time in years. The Oldsmobile company sponsored him to drive the car across the country once again, celebrating 26 years since his original victory. At 58 years old, Huss was pleased to recreate the historic run, especially since the nation's roads had improved greatly in the 2 decades since. In 1936, Old Scout was put on display at General Motors Exhibit Hall at the Chicago World's Fair. Almost 2 decades later, in 1954, it was displayed again at GM's traveling exhibit called the Parade of Progress. From 1975 to 76, Old Scout rode along on the American Freedom Train, a collection of historic artifacts that toured the nation for the bicentennial. However, after this point, the trail seems to run cold, and the location of Old Scout today is unknown. In the hopes of tracking it down, I reached out to the GM Heritage Center, the R.E. Olds Transportation Museum, and the National Museum of American History. While all of them have preserved examples of the curved dash runabout, none of them have Old Scout, nor do they know what happened to it. Even still, I like to believe that the car is somewhere out there today, perhaps forgotten in a barn or hidden away in a private collection. Dwight Huss himself enjoyed a long career in the automotive industry. He lived long enough to see the revolution of cross-country highways, something that had only been a dream in 1905. He passed away in 1964 at the age of 90. In 1995, to celebrate the 90-year anniversary of the race, members of Dwight Huss's family helped dedicate a historical marker in Santiam Pass. As drivers fly by on US Route 20 today, most are unaware of the historic race that took place here over a century earlier. But these good roads we take for granted are thanks in small part to these pioneering men, who understood that sometimes it takes a spectacle to inspire change.